Disney's Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs was a major achievement in filmmaking and animation. However, making a film of this nature in the 1930s was completely unheard of, and there are many barriers that Walt Disney faced to be able to make this movie. So many so, in fact, that this almost ended his entire career making this one film. And this film is a classic. I mean, who hasn't seen this movie? It is timeless. And no, I'm not going to show you a single video clip from this movie because you know that the copyright system is going to hand my ass on a platter. So we'll have some royalty-free clips instead. Walt Disney founded the Walt Disney Company in 1923, a business which started its roots making short animated films. In the late 20s, they were creative, having built up a repertoire of infamous characters like the company mascot Mickey Mouse himself. You know the films I'm talking about, those classics such as Steamboat Willie and Plane Crazy. But with the natural progression of all things, Walt Disney wanted to elevate his game. He was making these short movies, but decided that, well, they were popular and people liked them, so why not make one of these things into a feature-length movie? Given the time and dedication it takes for an animator to make one of these movies, back in the 20s mind you, this was a monstrous task, something, like I said, which has never been done before, at the time at least. After a period of detailed research and exploration for ideas, his goal for creating an animated feature film settled on the idea of using the story of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, a Brothers Grimm tale which was first published in Germany in 1812. Like many adaptations of established fairy tale stories, the more grisly and violent themes were removed from the concept of this movie to make it more accessible for all ages, to create this now iconic feature film. Like anyone that is trying to break into something which is completely unknown, the fact that really nobody is, as far as we're aware, attempted to do this before, you can imagine that there's a few hurdles in the way for somebody to be able to achieve this. For Walt Disney, in the making of this movie, there were many hurdles that he had to overcome. Pretty much all of which we're going to be discussing in this video. The first big hurdle, and probably one of the biggest ones of all, was money. Look, I'm not even going to beat around the bush here. Plain and simple, money. Money was needed to be able to fund and finance a movie of this scale, and if you didn't have it, then who's going to help you make it? The amount of time, effort and money it would take to make this thing with no guarantee that it would even pay off was a big gamble. There were differing opinions on the matter, with many critics claiming that animation could not hold the attention of an audience for the length of a feature film. Walt, however, studied previous movie successes and noted that feature films costing a few $100,000 could generate rich rewards from the box office. In 1928, Warner Brothers released The Singing Fool, a musical starring Al Jolson, which grossed $5 million, breaking box office records. Could his movie do the same? Despite all this and the many critics that stood in the way, Walt managed to secure a loan of about $150,000 to $250,000 to be able to make this movie, the budget for Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. Whilst Walt was able to acquire some of the money, he even had to dip into his own funds to be able to back the project itself. You know, if you've got a spare $200,000 rolling around, you can make anything happen. Most of the time. Look, to even talk about this is crazy, because in hindsight and knowing where we are now and what the Disney company has become, we know that this movie was an absolutely monstrous success. But back in the day, it was completely unknown. This was a massive gamble. It could have gone completely wrong, and this would have ended Walt's career. Like I said, many barriers. All it takes is for a few people bold enough and rich enough to take the risk. Now, I know I gave you the budget earlier, and that's the budget, mind you. The actual cost of making the movie was much higher than that. Over the course of 4 years, 750 studio artists would work long hours to create the feature-length production, costing the film a huge $1.5 million, which back in 1934 was an awful lot of money. Because of these costs, Walt and his brother Roy had to take out an emergency bank loan to be able to complete the project. This would not have been a good look at the time. This was not a straightforward production by any means, which is one reason why the cost estimate went spiralling out of control. Not only was this a new frontier, but Walt was, understandably, also a bit of a perfectionist. In a way, I sort of don't blame the guy. If you're sinking that much money into a project, you don't want to half-arse it, you want to make sure that it is perfect before release. Which leaves a lot to be desired for many movies that come out these days, which costs hundreds of millions of dollars and then turn out like complete horseshit. The first characters that the artists and animators worked on were of course the Seven Dwarfs themselves, to which he wanted them to be distinguishable on screen, not only by the design, but a way to tell them apart to be able to portray their individual personalities. So, over the course of many redrafts and many ideas coming and going, they eventually fell on the ideas and the designs of each individual dwarf, each having their own aspects and characteristics which would be unique to their personalities and, of course, the names that each of them were given. Snow White herself even went through various design changes, with differing hairstyles, colours, wardrobe, and look, I told you this guy was a perfectionist. It would be reported that the development of the movie would be such a toll on Walt that he even suffered a complete breakdown in 1935, resulting in him suffering sleep deprivation. And as you might imagine, all the critics at the time were slandering and pulling this movie through the dirt, without seeing the finished project, mind you. I mean, this would all change very soon, but there was a long way still to go before we were even in a position where the movie was ready to be shown to the public audience. As a result of this breakdown, Walt's partner took him to Paris for a break, to be able to get away from everything and just chill out for a bit. Whilst over there, he actually went and watched some movies, some of which were the Mickey Mouse shorts that he'd made, and he went to go and view what was a marathon of films. People who were sitting there and watching many clips for a long duration of time. So long in fact that it could be almost as long as a feature film itself. This was apparently all the inspiration Walt needed to go back to the studio and finish this movie. If people were able to sit and watch a movie for that long in this sort of format, then surely there are people out there that would love Snow White. So he returned to California. One aspect of making this film is not to simply put pen to paper, but if they wanted this to be as lifelike as possible, they would need to use real actors to perform and dance their scenes, which they would then use this as a point of reference to be able to make a frame-by-frame animation, effectively creating a template of sorts for the characters to use. A revolution in filmmaking used by Walt was called the multiplane camera, which was set on a rig with a number of levels set up to hold different cells to create depth and background layering, while giving animators freedom to move the cells as needed. This made animating multi-character scenes more creative and more dynamic. This looked great, with many individual moving characters making the screen an array of colour and movement. But with anything, to be able to create this, you need artists, and artists cost money. And I mean, there's only so much money to go around when you're already $1.5 million in the hole. So, the movie was being made and things seemed to be going well. And in the final scene of the movie, when the prince comes to wake up Snow White, spoilers by the way, even though the movie's almost 100 years old at this point, the prince actually shimmies on screen. An error with the animating, and if you look at the original, you can see this happening. As you might imagine, with Walt in his perfectionist ways, when he found out this occurred, he was fuming, because they'd spent $1.5 million on this movie, only for the prince at the end to shimmy across the screen. Demanding reshoots, this just physically wasn't possible. With time and budget constraints going down on the movie, this was not changed upon release, and was only changed on the remaster of the movie many years later. Walt's brother and business partner, Roy O. Disney, declared, "Let the prince shimmy," and so he did. This would be later changed in the digital restoration of the movie in 1993, but at the time, this just had to stay the way it was. There was only so much money left in the coffers at this point. In order to secure the funds to be able to finish the movie, Walt had to remortgage his house and sold pretty much everything he owned to be able to keep everything on track, including his car and many of his personal possessions. He had come this far and he was not going to fail now. At one stage, it was even reported that Walt had to try and convince his banker to be able to get the emergency loan, and the banker, being a bit unsure about the whole thing, wanted to see the movie. Bear in mind, this film was not finished yet. So, Walt showed him what they had so far, and the banker immediately agreed to fund the rest of the movie. Which, I mean, is pretty incredible. A, to be able to get a banker to agree to loan you money, but B, also on the basis that should have given him some confidence that there was something here. If people didn't have confidence in your product or your project, who's going to give you money for it? Despite costs being almost 10 times the costs he originally projected, pioneering many new techniques and concepts, Walt finally finished the movie, and the first screening was made on the 21st of December 1937. The movie was critically acclaimed, with reports of viewers giving the movie a standing ovation, and just to show it was going to be a beloved classic, the movie became an instant #1 hit, and would continue to keep that spot for the remainder of the year. Despite these huge risks imposed, and the great personal sacrifice that these people had to put in to make this movie happen, this paid off, and this was really the start of the Walt Disney Company we all know today. And if it wasn't for this movie, we would not have everything else we know today. And there is certainly a divide over how heavily CGI should be used in a movie. You get some cases where CGI is basically everything you see and it looks phenomenal, whilst on the other hand, particularly older movies, CGI is something which is used quite a lot, but not to good effect, or perhaps it's quite outdated, which gives you some rather memorable movies. However, there'll be other movies that use CGI, but decide to use it in a much more discreet way, something which perhaps isn't thrown in your face every 5 seconds in the movie. Many movies certainly don't stand the test of time and look incredibly dated and sloppy. It's not even the older movies that suffer from this problem. There's movies and shows even this year that are very questionable on how much of the CGI and how much money is even put into this thing. Looking at you, Marvel. However, in some movies it's a little bit more acceptable than others. If you're making a sci-fi movie, for example, where you're about to show a giant alien war, then perhaps CGI is what you need, because I think you'd be pretty hard-pressed to find something that wasn't digitally generated. Looking at you, Mars Attacks. You know, unless you decide to adopt some of the movie-making magic that some films make, such as Nollywood. Nothing further needs to be added there. But yes, it's incredibly easy for movie makers these days to just rely on CGI. If something doesn't go quite right in the filming process, they just patch it up later in post-production. Whilst it's one way to sort your problems out, it's certainly not foolproof, and it certainly has many, many pitfalls that people can fall into. So how do we avoid this happening? Well, how about we be more sparing with the use of CGI? In particular, if there's something where you don't necessarily need to have CGI, why not just do the real thing? And that is exactly what happened in the movie Interstellar. Christopher Nolan is a British producer, director and writer for many, many movies. He started out making many small independent movies, but quickly climbed the ranks into some of the biggest blockbusters ever made, including Inception, Dunkirk and The Dark Knight Rises. However, the movie we're talking about today is, like I said, Interstellar. A movie based on a team of space explorers who travel through a wormhole to ensure humanity's survival. You know, just everyday things to keep you on your toes. No biggie. So, for anybody that's not seen the movie, the crops, as a matter of fact, are quite a central plot element to the movie, which takes place amid an apocalyptic dust storm and with various crop failures in the year 2067. As this is one of the few crops that can be grown, it was an imperative resource that proved a real challenge for the crew of the mission. So yes, instead of just deciding to CGI the corn into the movie, which they could have very easily done, they decided not to, and that on the face of it is pretty impressive. But what is even more impressive is when you find out that when looking at these scenes in the movie and looking at where the corn is, something doesn't look quite right. Mainly due to the fact that in this area of the world, you don't get cornfields. So what are we looking at here? Yes, because we are technically on a foreign world in the movie, this can't just look like Earth. So he decided to make some very particular changes with his direction in this movie, particularly due to the fact that cornfields were found in very odd places, describing two natural elements that are rarely found side by side, acres upon acres of corn, and that of mountains in the distance. This type of terrain is not the kind of place where you would naturally find corn on Earth, due to the fact that the high winds around the mountains would likely kill off any crops that try to grow. Therefore, the heights of the corn and the high-speed winds wouldn't normally be compatible. However, Christopher Nolan's vision in this movie was very particular, so particular in fact that the farmhouse had to have a site overlooking a mountainside, and to have corn there as well means that you have to make something quite unnatural. To find such a set in real life would be next to impossible, so the prospect of making CGI corn seems all the more reasonable. But no, he decided to do one better. He wanted to keep the realism, and decided to go against nature and plant a crop field of corn near a mountainside. Yes, this is actually really impressive, and I know we're talking about corn today and that's not the most riveting topic in the world, but when you're looking at the fact that this is a multi-million-dollar film and that they could have simply just adopted CGI and decided not to, it does make you wonder why, particularly when the corn is such an intricate part of the movie. The corn itself has special significance given its role in the film and that they wanted to replicate that on set. To start with, the corn was specifically planted on location, which to begin with was an area of the world that just didn't have corn farmers. The elements when filming would prove to be an issue, but also science does not quite add up given that corn apparently doesn't burn, despite the fact that one of the characters in the movie decides to casually burn a cornfield without any hindrance. Guys, this is a sci-fi movie, and I imagine that 99.9% of the people watching didn't know or care about the fact that corn doesn't burn, but apparently it doesn't. And, well, I guess the people that made the film didn't know or care about that fact either. Unless this is very particular alien corn that can somehow be very flammable, but there you are. Christopher Nolan found an area of land about 500 acres in size to plant his cornfields. 500 acres, that is a big area. Just to give you some perspective on how big this is, that's about 400 football fields. That's a lot of corn, all for a movie, mind you. They actually decided to do this based on the fact that another movie he was involved with, Man of Steel, had planted a couple of 100 acres of corn for the filming by director Zack Snyder. So they looked into that and found that the farmhouse was really close to the mountains with enough land to plant the corn. This just kind of made sense as the perfect filming location. While they were able to use this for the filming, which I imagine saved some expense when it came to having to adopt CGI, what do you do with 500 acres of corn after the film is done filming? Well, he decided to sell it. Yes, the corn that was not meant to grow in that environment somehow managed to be farmed without issue, and they made some money on top of it as well. While it's not reported on how much money that they actually made from selling this corn, I'm a bit of a nerd and I was interested to find out how much they made and, if it was all worth it at the end of the day, so I did a little bit of a rough calculation. So, from 2013 to 2019, corn returns averaged about $253 per acre. So, given this very rough estimate, and based on nothing else at all, they could have made about $126,000 from the corn alone. Again, this is probably not accurate in the slightest, but I at least wanted to provide some context as to what they could have made just by simply deciding to plant real corn instead of faking it in with graphic designers. And you know what? I think we can all appreciate the real thing every now and again. Just some physical corn that you can actually touch, rather than seeing movie magic come out on the screen in front of you. Sometimes going back to basics is by far the most effective way of doing things, particularly when it earns you a shitload of cash at the same time. So it takes about 2 or 3 months to sow the seeds of corn and have it grow ready to be harvested. What you're telling me is if I'm able to convert my entire apartment into a giant cornfield, I can have a little bit of a side hustle at the same time. Whilst my apartment is not 500 acres in size, I might be able to make a little bit of money to help fund some of these things on the channel. So who knows, maybe I'll start a little patch in the corner and see where we go from there. And yes, we're talking about Die Hard today. For the absolutely uncultured amongst you, Die Hard is a 1988 American action film starring Bruce Willis and Alan Rickman as protagonist and antagonist in the movie. New York City police detective John McClane, played by Bruce Willis, is knee-deep in action as he scales a 40-story skyscraper in Los Angeles to prevent terrorists from, taking over. Lots of fight scenes happen, heroic action stunts are undertaken, and lots of explosions. Everything you could ever want in a Christmas classic. This is up there with the greats, I'm telling you right now. The production of the movie started from adapting a novel from 1978 called Nothing Lasts Forever, in which armed assailants chase a man through a building. Film producer Lloyd Levin gave the screenwriter Jeb Stewart creative freedom as long as he retained the Christmas in Los Angeles setting. The concept he considered would provide an interesting aesthetic. See? I told you it was a Christmas movie. Basically, this movie wouldn't exist if it wasn't for the Christmas elements in it. So, argument settled, people. The movie was pitched as Rambo in an office building, which sounds pretty damn epic, resulting in the project being greenlit. But if you want to film a movie based on a Rambo-esque character running through an office, where does one find such an office block? Anyone that's seen the movie will instantly recognise the main location in the movie, Nakatomi Plaza, as the place where much of the movie takes place. Obviously. The team chose this building for a number of reasons, but chief amongst which was that the building was, and is still, the headquarters of 20th Century Studios. This is the Fox Plaza in Century City, situated on the Avenue of the Stars. The building was chosen as it was iconic and needed character. Given that the building is the primary filming location for the whole shoot, they had to choose somewhere that would be pretty iconic. And oh boy did they pick a good choice. However, there was a lot more going into this than you might first think. Yes, it needs to look pretty cool and iconic, which I think they achieved that pretty well, but another important thing was that, basically because of the fact this building was the sole filming location for the entire movie, they had to have a lot of establishing shots from outside of the building where you can see it from a great distance. And that required a building that was unobstructed by other buildings. So this seemed like the perfect choice. The cast were actually looking at filming in many locations, but based on this building due to the fact that this was a 34-storey building and was currently only occupied by levels 4 and 5 at the time, leaving much of the building free for our Rambo character to run amok. Many stories were still under construction, which was perfect for many of the sets in the movie. It just so happens that the studio making the movie also owned the building that they decided to film in, meaning that you don't have to be quite as careful as you would be if you were renting a space out, for example. Also, any stunts or action scenes could be carried out, and I'm sure anything that was damaged could be pretty easily fixed up. They were allowed to film on the location under two conditions: no filming during the day and no damage from explosions. So yes, aside from those two rules, which, I mean, who follows rules, am I right? They pretty much had free roam as to what they wanted to do, so they could do action scenes like this, and this, and even this. What I find really interesting is that while Jeb Stewart was writing the screenplay, he did a tour of the building and immediately incorporated some of the locations and objects he found, in which he put this directly into the script as set pieces. This, for example, were some of the items like the carts that McClane and Carl end up riding during their fight. So just think, if the trolley was not left about on set, this scene may have never even made it into the movie in the first place. What's even more impressive is that when filming started, they didn't even know what the ending to the movie was going to be. So why not just run with it? So yeah, it was a pretty slap and dash operation that they'd get going and just see how it goes. However, everything wasn't completely plain sailing, due to the fact that the studio actually had to rent the space out from the company who already owned the building. If you get me. The budget for the movie was about $25 to $35 million, so as part of that went back into their own pockets technically, which is a pretty good idea if you ask me. Like I mentioned earlier, some levels of the building were actually still occupied, with the middle floors being occupied by legal and administrative departments. Therefore, the filming of scenes that involved gunfire had to be postponed until after hours because some of the employees from the active floors started to complain about the noise. Yeah, no. I can help you with that, don't worry about a thing. All I'm going to do is file this paperwork and... No, don't worry about it. No, we're fine. It's die-hard filming upstairs, so you're safe with me. So, the main shooting of the movie started in November 1987, with the completion of the building itself finishing in 1987. I assume that the filming of this movie may have delayed things somewhat. And I know what you're thinking if you've ever seen the movie, well, they were filming on location and they were told that they weren't allowed to use explosions. So what happened when scenes like this happened? Yeah, that looks like a pretty big explosion to me. But it's safe in the knowledge that they stuck by what they agreed. The building wasn't really damaged, and they achieved this by using a scale model. So yes, they didn't actually destroy the building itself, but just everything inside this very small building. Bruce Willis well and truly wrecked shop, destroyed the offices in the building, and pretty much destroyed everything that was owned by the studio making the movie. And best of all, he got paid for all of it. So he was getting paid to destroy his own boss's office. So yeah, we all know that Christmas starts when Hans Gruber falls off Nakatomi Plaza. Yippee-ki-yay, motherfucker. And I'm just gonna say it, if you can make a movie on a peanut budget and make millions of dollars out of it, you're doing something right. For those of you that may not know, the Blair Witch Project was a movie released on the premise that this was lost footage found from a handheld camera that has since been found. Almost like Paranormal Activity or Cloverfield. I know some people don't like this kind of movie as it seems kinda cheap and shaky, but that's the whole point. It's meant to be found footage. It's realistic due to the fact that in certain scenes, people are running for their lives rather than trying to get a good camera angle. So, whilst I don't mind this sort of thing, I can understand where the criticism comes from. The plot of the movie is that three young filmmakers set out to make a documentary about the Blair Witch, a mythical figure responsible for many disappearances and a string of deaths in the local town of Buckettsville, Maryland. They decide to venture into the woods because, horror stereotypes, and one by one they get brutalised and picked off, as you might expect. And yes, the entire time this movie's being shot, it is through the perspective of the filmmakers and their cameras making this documentary. And, spoilers and all, this film is 20 years old by now. They all go missing, and they've been missing ever since. Ooh, spooky. So, you might be wondering why people actually believe this was real, and why this all added to such a hype when the movie was first released. However, it might actually have something to do with the genius marketing that the filmmakers did before the movie was released. A fake website was created by director Eduardo Sanchez prior to the movie's release. The campaign transformed the Blair Witch into an urban myth. This website also purported that the actors themselves had genuinely gone missing. Online viral marketing campaigns were finding their feet, and this was certainly one way to do that. This helped cement the idea that this was genuinely a story of three missing teens. However, to achieve such realism, the making of the movie was also taken to its limits to try and create a compelling and realistic witch hunt. Daniel Myrick and Eduardo Sanchez directed, wrote and edited the movie, but some interesting choices were made when deciding to make this movie all the way up to the point where they pitched this to investors. In that, they tried to convince the investors that this also was a real movie. We showed investors this video. It was basically like a little 8-minute documentary about what we were going to do about the disappearance of these kids. We really played it off as real. We had fake newspaper articles, news footage, crazy stuff like that. They immediately would be shocked and say, well, where are these tapes? You actually have these tapes? We would say, well, we could have these tapes if you gave us a little money. Yes, it was one thing to construct an urban legend for the promotion of the movie, but it's another thing to be that dedicated to the idea that you did it even before you had funding for the movie, claiming that this was all real and even convincing your own investors to invest in your project. Pretty slick stuff. The same thought even went into the idea of when they were trying to find cast for the movie, and by cast I mean the three teenagers because there's pretty much no one else in the movie. But effectively they had a whole host of different fake news articles, interviews, news snippets, all this cool stuff to try and build a world showing that these children had genuinely gone missing. The real challenge, however, came to the actual filmmaking process, where they had their cast of 3 amateur filmmakers and then basically just sent them out into the woods, with the cameras to film themselves and create footage for the movie. Directing of these kids was a pretty hands-off approach, all things considered. And yes, one of the big criticisms of this movie is that this is basically a video of 3 kids wandering around the woods, and if that's what you thought, then I don't blame you, because that is pretty much what most of the movie actually is. And it was intended that way. Given the fact that these filmmakers were actually just given the cameras and then basically being told to film themselves in the forest. So what else do you film? Walking around in the forest, I guess. It wasn't like these guys were given a film crew or a set or anywhere to stay. They were by themselves. There was no one else there. Well, no one else in sight anyway. Yes, no director, no supporting cast or crew, nothing apart from these 3 actors in the woods by themselves with cameras. They were pretty much left to their own devices to create the footage for the movie. The only directions they received were notes left at various checkpoints, along with batteries for the cameras and a dwindling amount of food. So the filmmaking process would be the actors walking all day to the new checkpoint, they basically set up camp, and then basically the film crew would track them down, find where they were camping, and then decide to terrorize them throughout the night, creating the very scary scenes that you see in the movie. The reactions of the crew, obviously knowing that this wasn't a real Blair Witch demon in the woods, in some respects gave genuine fear and horror. Look, if it's 4 AM and I know that I'm filming a movie and someone decides to come and boot my tent down, I'm going to be pretty pissed off, regardless of whether it's a demon or Frank the director. Either way, I'm not going to be a happy bunny. This form of method acting went on for some time, with the kids being in the woods for 7 days total, by themselves, basically picking up rations and food as they go. And this had a bit of an impact on them, not only due to the fact that they were completely isolated, but also due to the fact that the food rationing they would be given would be very slowly weaned down, meaning that the crew would become hungry, tired and stressed over the days, not knowing where they are or what to do. This trick in filmmaking made this whole ordeal quite traumatic for the actors involved. Despite knowing that they were doing this all for a movie, if they put the actors through a grueling few days of hell, this would translate onto the screen very, very well. This was achieved by keeping them up at night, harassing the actors and making them more and more tired out. The directors always said that they didn't jeopardize their health, but the actors themselves don't look back on the filming of this movie with any particular delight. So yeah, that was the process. They would basically just lead them from one point to another, get them incredibly tired and hungry, scare them in the night, and then basically make their life a living hell. So yes, a large proportion of this movie is improv acting or just taking the environment around the actors. There is a very small part of it which is scripted due to the fact that the director would give the characters some general idea of what was going to happen on the day or certain things that need to happen, such as this person's going to potentially disappear, you need to react in this way if someone says this thing to you, but that's generally it. A few pointers of the direction that the director wants to take the movie, and then let's leave them to it. Sounds like a pretty good idea. And like I said, it was made on a shoestring budget, so this simple concept was very, very profitable. So profitable, in fact, that the movie made $250 million on the box office release, which is pretty good going. This was so successful, in fact, that this was considered one of the most successful independent movies of all time, based on the fact that the movie only cost about $60,000 to produce. There was an increased cost after this due to some post-production edits that needed to be made, but that pales in comparison to the gross profits that this movie made in the end. So, my advice to you, you young budding filmmaker, is that if you want to make a successful movie, make a lost footage movie, make it for a few bucks, and then basically sell it for $250 million. Seems pretty simple. So, for those of you wondering, it has some variation of this, basically saying that anybody in the film is fictional, and if they have any resemblance to anybody in real life, it's just coincidental. You know, if it actually is or not, but the disclaimer's there to kind of cover all bases. As you might imagine, the main purpose behind this is to fend off potential litigation, which is correct, and is the primary reason why this thing is in a lot of movies. But what was the one thing to trigger this, to make this such a popular use of a disclaimer? I mean, basically, it must have had a profound effect for everybody to use it, so what the hell was it? Anyone who feels like filing a lawsuit for libel might be fended off by such a disclaimer. But how did this all come about? And why are filmmakers now so cautious to make sure this disclaimer is present wherever it is needed? It seems to have originated as a response to a suit against the makers of a 1932 movie called Rasputin and the Empress. The movie was about a man called Rasputin, a peasant to become mystical healer and lover. Look, the man deserves an entire video himself, and I'm going to be straight up with you guys. He's on the list. I have an absolutely huge list of video ideas that I want to get through, and he is on the list. I'm going to make a video on him one day in the future. Don't know when. Maybe if you want to see more, then let me know in the comments, but sometime. So we will go over this briefly, but not in any vast detail, just enough to get a good understanding of what actually happened and why this is so important for this movie. Yes, this man led a crazy, crazy life. What you need to know for today's video is that he managed to gain incredible influence over the Russian imperial family, a man who managed to break his way into the highest echelons of Russian royalty. The story of this guy is pretty incredible, all the way from his mystical powers to the many, many assassination attempts made on his life, to which he miraculously survived nearly all of them. This was the perfect idea for a movie. Oh yeah, so I should mention that this guy, like I said, was subject to many, many assassination attempts, mainly by conservative aristocrats who kinda hated the guy, and he somehow managed to cheat death again and again and again. Led by an aristocrat called Felix Yusupov, the assassinations in the real world occurred round and about 1916. So, just a few years later, in the year 1932, MGM decided that this would be a fantastic plot for a film, and decided to use basically everything that happened in this guy's life to make a full feature-length movie out of it. Fantastic. I imagine there's going to be absolutely no problems with that whatsoever. Seems as though that Rasputin had barely been dead for a couple of decades at this point. This movie had an absolutely huge budget, going so far to try and recreate the Imperial Russia, as you can imagine, which was a huge, huge effort. MGM made a number of big changes, such as suggesting that there was just one assassin, an entirely fictitious made-up man called Prince Shekadev, who was basically a new character created as an amalgamation of all the actual assassination attempts made on the life of Rasputin during his life. Almost like a best-of compilation tied up into one character arc of this movie. So yes, that's one creative change they decided to make. Fair enough, if you want to make a movie interesting, maybe make a few tweaks. But the problem is when things get a little bit more serious. So much so that MGM decided to try and rewrite history by claiming that the wife of the assassin in the movie, a character called Natasha, was assaulted by Rasputin. This is something that never happened in real life, but they decided to put it in to try and make Rasputin more of a villain character throughout the movie. I mean, look, sure, I am not the kind of person to try and dissuade people from making creative decisions about movies they're making to try and make it more engaging and interesting. But if you're basing this on real life, particularly if it's something that happened recently, at the time, you might want to be quite careful because, that might come back to bite you later on. Anywho, the reason for this, as described by MGM's creative head Irving Thalberg, was to contrast Rasputin with the Tsar, and trying to make the Tsar a much more likeable character. So yeah, that's one way to do it. Just make the Tsar really likeable in comparison to that big meanie Rasputin. The comparison is gleamingly clear, and I don't think that they could have just made the Tsar a more likeable character. They had to make Rasputin bad in comparison to even make the Tsar likeable. I mean, there seems to be a few problems there, but you be the judge of that. The craziest thing about all of this was that this whole thing wasn't even a surprise, because MGM had a number of researchers working with them for the movie to make sure that everything was as historically accurate as possible. And a researcher made a comment to them which maybe the legal team should have been a little bit more alive to. Yes, this is due to the fact that one of the researchers hired for the movie even warned the creative director of MGM that the current wife of Yusupov, who was still alive by the way, the guy who led the assassinations against Rasputin in real life, could be mistaken for Natasha in the movie. Things are getting a little bit more heated in here now. Yusupov claimed that the movie was defamatory. The problem for him, however, was that he'd actually confessed to the assassination plots in his memoir a few years earlier, so he was kind of shit out of luck here. His wife, however, had a bit more grounding on her allegations. Yes, his real-life wife, Irina, argued that the character Natasha had many features and characteristics that could be drawn very, very similar to her. Almost like that the character of Natasha was based on Irina. You know, the woman that Rasputin assaulted in the movie, something that never happened in real life, but for anybody that knows the people here, they might put two and two together and then Bob's your uncle. That same defamation argument arose again, and MGM on this occasion were in a little bit more of a sticky position. But don't worry guys, because they had that infamous disclaimer in place. Actually they didn't. It is as a result of all this that the disclaimer came to be. They had a rather different disclaimer at the prologue of the movie, which kinda shot them in the foot a little bit. It read as follows. A few of these characters are still alive. The rest met death by violence. The lawyers should have been all over this, beating MGM with sticks to make them realise what an absolute fuck up they'd just made. So yeah, this basically said that everyone in the movie was real, including the fact of the clearly fake character and his wife, who was seemingly similar to that of the wife of the actual assassin in real life. Sweet baby Jesus of mercy. A claim was issued through the English courts, and it was argued that Yusupov's wife could be identified as Natasha in the movie due to Natasha's relation with the fake character made up in the movie, the assassin who basically made all of the assassination plots against Rasputin, which just so happened to be the exact assassination plots that Yusupov did in real life against Rasputin. You know, the same ones that he had in a few years prior already admitted to doing in his memoir. And in addition to this, MGM also didn't do any favours due to the fact that Natasha looked awfully similar to Irina, based on the fact that they gave her the same body structure, same facial features, and, well, basically made it the same person. So they weren't really getting out of this one very easily. Just to top it all off, the characters were the exact same age. So, yeah. As you might imagine, the decision went the only way which you think it would go, because the jury made a decision in 30 minutes of hearing the evidence, and decided that MGM were guilty of libel, with an order of £25,000, or at the time $125,000. That is equal to about $2.5 million today. That is a nasty blow, even by MGM standards. Yes, so this whole thing happened, and due to an absolute mess up by many people running the film and the disclaimer they'd placed at the start, they thought that maybe they need something else to be a little bit more foolproof in the future. And the solution came when the Chief Justice made comment on the outcome of the case, basically saying that this entire saga could have been avoided if they used the appropriate disclaimer to basically say that everybody in the movie were basically fictitious and made up, not based on anybody in real life. Hence the reason why you see this disclaimer in nearly every single TV show and movie that you've ever seen. The one big example that I always go back to when thinking about this disclaimer is this one, which you've probably seen at the start of every single episode of South Park. And the reason they have this on, as you can imagine, is to avoid lawsuits. Because of the fact that the show take the piss out of many pop culture icons and celebrities, they need something to give them a little bit of legal backing to try and make sure that they don't get sued into the ground, hence the reason why they've gone strong for many, many years. So, to answer the question at the very start of the video, why does every single movie have this disclaimer? Well, the simple answer is money. Companies and businesses want to save money. They don't want to get sued. So, there you are. If you like the video, be sure to like and subscribe. If you want to be notified as soon as I upload my next video, be sure to hit the bell button. And if you've got any ideas for what topics you'd like me to discuss next, let me know down in the comments below. As always, sources used in the video will be in the description. Guys, there's a few lessons to be learned here. Look, if you're a guy that wants to sue for defamation, maybe don't admit to all your assassination plots in a memoir a few years earlier, because that might scupper you a little bit. But, on the other hand, if you're a filmmaking company that wants to make a movie about something in real life, maybe just stick a random disclaimer at the start, you know, basically just to cover your own ass in case somebody decides to sue you. Just a bit of friendly advice there Not legal advice, because if we're talking about disclaimers, then I'm going to throw a disclaimer on this disclaimer to make sure that you've been disclaimed the entire way through this entire video that this is a disclaimer. I'll see you guys in the next video. Fantastic.